Okay, so different from previous weeks, what we're going to do today is I'm going to actually go over these hands on Poker Juice and give you a little bit more of an in-depth discussion about the hands that we are covering on the 2+2 forum. So this first hand, I'm just going to remind you, and I'll link to it in the email as well. But the first hand here is Ace-7-8-8 double suited. Again, I'll link it. But, we talk about that the villain's a passive nit, or the original poster describes the villain as a passive nit, perceives us as a lag, someone who's on the laggy, gambly side. We're pretty deep stacks are 3K. We open Ace-8-8-7 double suited under the gun 5-handed, which I think is a fine open. And the villain under the gun 1 calls, and the big blind and the straddle call. Comes Ace-9-5 two-tone. All right, so let's take it from here. So let's pull up the action here. We've got a straddle from, well, it's kind of hard to do the game builder with straddles on Poker Juice, but we did the best that we could. So after raising pre, we go 4-way to the flop. Now the flop comes Ace-9-5 two-tone. So this is a pretty interesting spot, right? And this is something that people don't really understand well enough, but how high your flush draw is, number one, is extremely important. Number two, like, our hand would be extremely strong in like a heads up situation where we were the button and we were facing the big blind. And the reason is because the big blind's range is a lot wider. So we can, he has fewer, two pairs. He has fewer dominating flush draws. In general, his range is just a lot wider and weaker. But in this situation, there's a couple of things that concern me. One is that the cutoff who peeled is actually pretty tight, and he peeled an under the gun open. So that's kind of an alarm bell for me in the first place. I'd be less concerned if he peeled on the button, just because players' ranges are wider on the button. But in general, especially this deep, it's pretty miserable to face a raise. So I think that in situations like this, especially in multi-way pots, I like to have the upper part of the weaker part of my range, if that makes sense, rather than betting and basically being at the bottom of what I want to stack off with. And it's nice because we can continue on almost any turn. We have backdoor nut flush draw, we have a nut gutter, we have a flush draw. So there's just a lot of different turns that we can continue on. I think if this was a situation where we were second to act and it was a 3-way pot, I'd be a lot more likely to bet, but it's a 4-way pot. So in general, in 4-way pots, I play pretty straightforward. So I certainly don't always c-bet this. If I was to c-bet, let's say I had Ace-8-6-7 with hearts, I think that would be a hand that I would c-bet, but with just the naked gutter, I think it makes it a little bit worse. It's not that I expect to get raised here a ton, but I think that getting raised here is like, even by, like, let's say we get check raised, I'm still not we're never folding, but I'm not thrilled about getting it in against players. Somebody could have ace with a better flush draw. They could have they certainly can have a better flush draw pair with so I still think that checking is probably the best play. But I don't hate c-betting, but I like c-betting a lot more in 3-way pots. But we see that we do c-bet and we get raised. Again, it's a situation where we can't really fold. One thing that's good about these situations is I feel like when people raise here, they kind of polarize themselves to sets. It's a pretty specific king-high flush draw hand that can raise here. So what king-high flush draw hand peels from the cutoff and then is strong enough to raise here? People don't really peel, for example, King-8-7-6 with a flush draw. So I think that on flush completing turns, he's going to play straightforward unless he has the flush. So we should be able to play pretty well on later streets, actually. So I don't mind calling. Turn's interesting because it pairs the board and gives us a nut flush draw. But it goes check, check. The river, we actually make our nut flush, and our opponent bets 450. So again, I think that just because we're playing someone who's passive and nitty, I don't see very many bluffs. And what's even more important is, again, it's pretty difficult for somebody to have, he literally has to have exactly 876x that actually decided to raise the flop and is now bluffing. And since this guy's passive and nitty, I generally would make a tight fold. I don't hate calling because of the price we're getting. You can see that we only have to be right about a quarter of the time, getting 2.88 to 1. But I just think that given the reads on our opponent, that I still think that we should fold. All right, in this next hand, we've got a situation. Let me pull over the hand here, where, again, I'll link to it in the email, where we've got ace, queen, queen, 9 double suited. The cutoff is straddled to 10. We pot it to 35 with a pretty good hand. Or villain on the button pots it to 35. We raise to 100 in the hijack. Oh, I see. Okay, so we basically are out of position in this hand. This is an awkward straddle situation. We threw it out of position with a solid hand. Ace, queen, queen, 9 double suited. Hello. And he calls on the button. So the flop comes ace, king, deuce, two-tone. Now let's get back to the action. Now, only reason I'm showing this is because the villain's image is pretty tight, and he's a winning player. So in general, I'm going to give my philosophy on this type of hand. And again, you'll have to forgive me for, you're going to have to forgive me for kind of the blind structure here in the game builder, but it's the best I could do. So we 3-bet. He calls ace, king, deuce, two-tone. So this is a situation where, first of all, you can see, I'm not sure why our equity is so poor. I guess we did, our equity should be a lot better than 28%, so I'm not sure what happened here. Oh, because he put in the post-flop range. Okay, that's fine. So, now, here's the thing, right? In general, I prefer betting these types of boards, especially when we're out of position. I think that if you don't have a hand that's not good enough to check call with, then you should generally bet, especially on boards that are favorable for your range. Now, as a rule of thumb, the first question you want to ask yourself is, does this board favor my range, or is this board bad for my range? It can be challenging in PLO in particular to apply aggression when you don't have anything because, hey, people have 4 cards and it seems like you run into hands all the time. But actually, when you look at when it really boils down to frequencies, and especially on these heavier boards, people really only have strong hands like 12 to 15% of the time. So C-bets are going to be very effective. And in general, not in just 3-bet pots, but also in single raised pots, a good philosophy to have is to play the board and rather than your actual hand. And it's also a good habit to get into because as you move up and you become more advanced, it really becomes more about, does this board favor my range? Does this turn card favor my range? And that decides a lot whether you decide to bet it or not. Now, of course, there's other factors like what you block, opponent tendencies and stuff like that. But in general, it's a good philosophy. So, I think that especially against someone who he describes as a frequent winning player, checking can induce you to make more mistakes. Now, let's say that I had a hand like ace, queen, queen, jack. I actually think with like a backdoor flush draw or something like that, that's a hand that I feel like is strong enough to actually check call with. We have some protection on later streets, and we can more effectively check call later on and induce bluffs that we can't call. But in general, when you're out of position and you're looking to polarize your range, you don't want to polarize with hands. The first rule of thumb is you don't want to polarize with hands that aren't good enough to call with. I see people make that mistake a lot. Now we do decide to bet and we get called. Now the turn's an offsuit 7, which is all things considered a massive brick. I like betting here again, and here's why. So the first reason is we don't have any diamonds, so it makes it more likely our opponent has a flush draw. Second of all, we block nutted 2 pairs that can raise us, so we block ace king, we block ace deuce, and ace 7. And besides, like ace deuce and ace 7 can't raise us anyway. So we have a lot of protection in that way, given like our pre-flop range and given what our actual hand is. So I prefer betting. I think that if you check, it looks like you're giving up and you're kind of opening yourself up to getting bluffed. So the thing that's nice about betting is you don't have to bet very much to get kind of thin value and also give yourself some protection on the river. If you bet the if you bet the turn and he calls, it's a lot hard. It's much more difficult for your opponent to bluff you on the river. You're buying yourself a lot of showdowns. The problem is once you check, you kind of commit to checking the river as well, and our hand doesn't improve on very many rivers. So I mean, like even on a river queen, it's not, we're not like thrilled about betting it for value, for example. So I prefer betting again. We get thin value against his range, in my opinion, and also it prevents us from getting bluffed. But we see that it actually goes check, check. And as mentioned, we don't improve on very many rivers. The river's an offsuit 6, and now we're faced with a pretty tough spot. In this situation, if I'm the villain, like I'm value betting certainly any aces up hand. I think I would even consider value betting any kings up. I think it's thin, but I think it's actually not bad. Depends what you think about your opponent. I think that against really good aggressive opponents, I wouldn't do this. But against fish, I think that you can go thin and like bet small with king 7, for example. We 3-bet pre. Like there's not too many aces up combo hands that play it like that. So we should be good. And if you think you're never getting bluffed, then I think that that's totally fine. If you're playing someone who actually might check raise bluff, then I would check back those hands. Yeah, I think that this is a pretty good example of like why betting the turn is a good play. So, yeah, let's check out some hands next week. Thanks for watching the video.